Welcome back to the channel of truth, trust, and transparency. Today, I'm going to show you how using a buyer's agent and paying the exorbitant fees could actually set you back in your property portfolio. Now, of course, they're not going to tell you this, so I might as well be the only one speaking about it. Let me show you what I mean. So, scenario on the left-hand side in the red is with a buyer's agent. Scenario on the right-hand side in the blue is without a buyer's agent. To keep things super simple, we are going to assume a growth rate cycle of 10% in the first year, 20% in the second year, 10% in the third year after that, and so then 6% onwards, just to keep numbers nice and easy. The principle is the same no matter how much these numbers jump around. Now, I did a video last week regarding should you buy and should you sell, and one of those options the buy and hold, I wanted to include that without the buyer's agent fee, because I think a lot of the narrative is you need to use a buyer's agent. You know, they're the only people that can find these suburbs that are doing these sorts of growth rate cycles. But to be honest, I think the fees that they charge make scaling a portfolio incredibly difficult, and you'll see why. Now, I've tried to keep things as transparent and as unbiased. Obviously, I'm not a buyer's agent, so I apologize if there is some bias towards not using one. However, if you do disagree or you had any other comments, please let me know. I'm happy to do a part 2 like I did last week. I'm going to assume that in both instances, I'm starting out with $100,000 in cash. This is the growth rate cycle, and obviously borrowing capacity will vary person to person. So for this example, it's more about starting point and scaling rather than it is serviceability and borrowing capacity, because that will vary from person to person. Again, the principles are the same, and you'll see why. So with a buyer's agent and you having $100,000, because of the upfront costs required for a particular purchase, we go to the most expensive purchase that we can make on $100,000 in cash. That works out to be about a $400,000 purchase. Now, why is that? You have a 40%, 10% deposit, 25 grand buyer's agent fee, $10,000 in LMI, you have $15,000 in stamps, and then you have about $5,000 in legals and other fees. That all up equals 95 grand, so we're pretty much bang on the $100,000 price point. Now, 3 years later, that particular property that you've bought for 400 grand with a buyer's agent, let's just say it does this run of the growth cycle. 10% first year, takes it to 440, 20%, and then 10% in the third year. After 3 years, that particular property is going to be worth $580,000 in value. The loan, which is the purchase price minus the deposit, is going to be $360,000. It leaves us with about a 62% LVR and 100 grand of usable equity. Now, unfortunately, there's not much we can do using a buyer's agent. We can't split that into two property purchases, because your buyer's agent's fees alone would be half of that, right? So your only option is to make another purchase with 100 grand cash, which is exactly what we've done here, which would equal another $400,000 purchase. Now, I haven't put the purchase prices, the costs of acquiring that asset, because they're right here. $400,000. 3 years later, again, we end up with 2 properties. Now, the first property, 3 years later, on top of that, so 6 years total, property 1 is valued at $690. How we got there? $580,000 property. It had its growth run, and now it did 6% for the last 3 years, meaning it's 690 grand. We're going to say that the loan is still $360,000, and we'll apply the equity used, which is 100 grand, against property number 2. Property number 2, $400,000. Now you need to take this into calculation. Property number 2 was a $400,000 house. We know that this grows to 580 because it did the same in the first 3 years for the property 1. So its value is 580. Now the loan on that particular property, we're going to say that you refinance and you structured it to put it against that property. You can put it against either one. It's not going to affect the bottom line. However, $400,000 purchase, you've used 100 grand worth of equity because of all these costs, meaning you've got a $100,000 loan, and you've also got the $400,000 loan for the property. So you have a $500,000 loan and a $580,000 value property, meaning after 6 years, your portfolio will be valued at 1.27 mil, which is 690 and 580. You'll have $860,000 worth of debt, which is 360 and 500, 860. Your total portfolio LVR will be 67%. And you'll have usable equity. Remember, usable equity is your portfolio value times it by 0.8 minus the debt. So we do 1.27, we times that by 0.8, and then we minus our original debt, meaning we have usable equity of $156,000. Now, that's 6 years' time if you're using a buyer's agent. Now, scenario 2 is without using a buyer's agent. And this is what I think a lot of buyer's agents won't tell people out there, because obviously it's not in their best interest to not use them. So they're obviously going to tell you, you have to do this way, ended up with this type of portfolio. Now, here's what you can do instead. If you don't use a buyer's agent and you have 100 grand, well, then you've got an extra $25,000 to play with. What does that mean? That means you can get into a more expensive asset, $550,000. You put down a 10% deposit as well. You don't have a buyer's agent fee, LMI, stamp duty, and legals. Still, it's a little bit more money, but when we add that all together, we're sitting at 100 grand. So we've been able to get into a more expensive asset. Now, after the same growth run, 10, 20, 10, 3 years later, that particular $550,000 property grows in value to $798. Now, for the purpose of this video, a lot of these prices, a lot of these values, I have left the hundreds off just to round it up for round numbers, because it's easier to follow and easier to say. So that value is up at $798,000. Now, our loan size was $550 minus our deposit, $495,000 loan. Our LVR is 62%, but this time, because we've bought a more expensive property, we've been able to get into a more expensive property, we've now got $143,000 of usable equity. Now, my friends, this is where the magic happens. Because I don't have to pay $50,000 of that to a buyer's agent, I can just split that into 2 more property purchases. How much, you ask? That's probably 70 odd grand is probably the purchasing cost you can get into a $350,000 property on. So $350,000 property, if we take into account 35 grand deposit, stamps, LMI, and legals, we're all in for 60 grand on each of these. Now, you might say, LMI and stamps are a little bit more or anything like that. That's fine. We have 143. I've only used 120 of it there. We've got a buffer now, which is great. So where does that put us in the 3 years later that we did over here? Well, that property one, that was 798 after the first year. When 798 grows at 6% for 3 years, it's now worth $948,000 in value. Remember, the loan, we're going to associate the equity loan, we're going to tie to both of these, and I'll do it soon. Loan of $495,000, meaning you have a 52% LVR, sitting really low. This is where the magic comes in though. The two $350,000 property purchases have now grown, same growth cycle as everywhere else, we've been fair and just using that to show you, have both grown in value to $508,000. Now, the loan was obviously the $350,000 purchase, plus the equity loan to purchase that property. So $350,000 and the $60,000 equity loan, we put them on top of each other. It gets us to $410,000 loan and a $508,000 value. Now these are sitting pretty much on 80% LVR each. Perfect, nice and safe. Same with this one. This is the numbers that'll blow your mind though. Now, my portfolio value is $1.964 million. Almost $700,000 difference. Now, of course, I've got a little bit more debt because I own more properties. 1.3 mil worth of debt, 67% LVR. My usable equity, if I did it myself, after 6 years, would be 250 grand in cash. Over here, my usable equity, 150 grand. So not only have I got an extra 100 grand of usable equity, but here's the key part. I then have $1.964 million growing at 6%. Now, if that's going to grow at 6%, the next year after, I'm going to make $117,000 just in capital growth. Over here, if that same portfolio value, 1.27, grows at 6%, I'm only going to make 72 grand. So not only am I better off now, 40 grand a year in the first year, and remember that's going to compound, so that difference is only going to get better. So not only per year am I going to be 40 grand plus better in terms of portfolio growth, not only do I have a more expensive and more higher valued property portfolio, I also have over 100 grand more usable equity compared to if I use the buyer's agent. So you tell me if you see value in this side or you see value in that side, but the numbers are black and white, red and blue. Can you argue with that? I'm not too sure. Let me know in the comments. Last but not least, the most important thing to understand as well from this entire video. Now, I actually cut the video short and I've just reset up the camera to include it because I was like, how could I not include this? One thing that buyer's agents will tell you is to just use the equity to make that second purchase, which includes their fee. What they don't tell you is that when they have a 25K buyer's agent fee, and you use the equity, that equity is a home loan that you pay, let's say 6% on for the next 30 years. Do you want to know how much interest you end up paying on that fee? Because it's rolled into a home loan that you've then got for 30 years. You pay about 30 grand in interest, which means their fee isn't 25. Their fee equals out to be 55 grand. Just something to keep in mind next time you're thinking about using a buyer's agent and paying for their fee out of equity.